what is the tie between big tobacco and big food? Enlighten us.
Well, it turns out that it's been much stronger than I think most scientists and, the general public have realized. The U.S. tobacco, basically the largest companies, R.J. Reynolds and Philip Morris, who were, pretty influential and some of the heaviest hitters in the tobacco epidemic in the 50s. They owned and developed leading U.S. food companies and brands, and basically dominated our food industry for over 20 years. I found this out by actually looking at their primary source documents, like from the industry. Because I think if somebody had told me this, just on the face value, I'd be like, oh, come on. Like, that seems pretty wild, right? That's a pretty major claim.
I'm getting the feeling you might need a bodyguard.
Start looking behind the bushes. So yeah, and this wonderful resource that's available and publicly available. Anyone in the world can access this site. It's from the University of California, San Francisco Industry Documents Library. And they house and collect documents from any industry that affects public health. And so they have had available these documents that they were able to collect and store for public, to make publicly available from the tobacco litigation in the early 2000s. And so these have been available, and I learned about them because, kind of in the vein of asking, like, is this too wild? Like, is this too crazy of an idea that these two, tobacco and food, could be connected in any kind of meaningful manner? In my initial online search, I found these two papers from Dr. Laura Schmidt, who's a professor at UCSF, and her colleagues, that established that the U.S. tobacco companies applied their marketing strategies to sell sugary drinks to children, like applied their tobacco marketing strategies to marketing sugary drinks to children. And then they applied their broader skills that they developed with targeted marketing to different racial and ethnic groups in the US with their cigarette brands. They applied that to selling foods.
Right. So they just saw this as an opportunity to kind of leverage another form of addiction to drive profits.
So I think the first question was like, they looked at this from a marketing approach, and they saw that, these problematic and very aggressive tactics that were developed for cigarettes were applied to food. I think there was from those studies, it was important because they established that, like, they applied these similar skills that really drive sales. But the question for me was like, well, did this have anything to do with foods being hyper palatable, or could this purely just be argued as, like, as you mentioned, like, it's a commercial business. They were, in the 80s, they were starting to really lose, sales volume and things like that from the tobacco epidemic, incurring litigation. And so one could argue that this was a logical business decision, and applying their expertise and their knowledge of, like, selling cigarettes to another business, so in and of itself, so in and of itself, like, that, there's still some leeway to say, like, okay, maybe it was just business. Maybe it was just, like, kind of the capitalism,
So is this purely something that you've looked into from for interest's sake, or what's I guess the relevance of that connection with regards to looking forward and the prospect of being able to change the system?
I think that that sets up a very different premise. the potential for there to have been an industry that created a lot of public harm and basically specialized in creating addictive tobacco products could be creating foods in a similar way to make them, difficult to stop eating. I think that premise is really, it's highly concerning, and it's very different from how we view foods and how they've kind of originated as like, foods need to provide us nutrients and caloric value. And so I think it, for me, shifted my understanding of what these products are and how they may operate. And so I think that really gets at the question that I think, this is still an open question in the field, and a lot, you talk to different people, they have wildly different, kind of views. And I think for, since, really the beginning of time, we viewed food as something that was necessary and, may be more or less healthy, but like we need to consume food, and all food is kind of considered to be the same thing, food. Whereas if we know that there is, kind of a differential origin or
very strategic
reason
process
for that these foods may be available and they are how they are, then that lends to an interpretation of like, maybe we should not be comparing these same things as different types of food. Maybe they're more like food substances and they should be treated accordingly.
Right. Which then makes you think about the intention of the industry. Are they willing to play ball with reformulations, or does there need to be kind of more draconian measures to really change the way that people are consuming food? And I have to imagine that unless it was draconian, if I'm CEO of one of these food companies and you're asking me to reformulate to make foods less palatable, I'm immediately thinking, well, that means less sales for all the products that we make. We're going to sell less calories. So our yearly revenue is going to come down.
Yep.
So unless you're willing to, say, for example, provide me with a tax cut as a company, maybe if I meet your recommendations and I reduce my sodium and fat and you spare me some tax and my net position is similar, I'm not really incentivized to do that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, and I think it's that's why the voluntary approach to, companies voluntarily like reformulating some of their products or things like that, like just would not be effective, because you're facing sales losses. The competition in the market does not change in any fundamental way. And so, yes, without something buoying that, I don't think that would be very effective. But if you have kind of at the federal level, everybody's required, you have a leveling effect where it's like, well, all the competitors are not able to sell these anymore either, so like it doesn't drastically, hurt, some sales for like one company who attempts this, voluntary, decrease relative to other companies.
Are there any countries around the world that have tried to regulate this, better than the United States, or is this very much just like a global problem and we're waiting for research to kind of quantify everything and then inform policy?
Mm-hmm. There are certain countries that have, so some countries have focused a little bit on like specific nutrients. Others have focused on, there are several in South America that have done a really nice job of trying to kind of regulate the ultra processed foods. So there are kind of some activities happening in other spaces in the world. So far again, and this kind of standardized definition of, hyperpalatable foods is quite new. And so we're still doing, I think, a lot of the work to, kind of, inform, like you said, like being able to make predictions about, if we had a policy that, required these foods, to have their formulations changed or things like that, how that would impact public health. But I think a lot of it, part of the reason that I wanted to have a definition that was quantitative and could clearly identify what these foods are is that, governments have struggled globally to regulate products or figure out what about these foods or what's going on with these foods that are making, that are yielding these like massive public health problems with metabolic disease and obesity and things like that. And so part of my intention with this work and my hope is that providing some very clear and explicit criteria, if supported by evidence, over time can give more specific information that people can regulate on.